and welcome to our Wednesday night study. Tonight, as we explore in the news, I want to start off with giving you a couple things that you've heard in different ways from me before, but I want to keep you alerted to it. This article is Recognizing the Signs of the Times, a warning to our generation. About 2,000 years ago, Jesus rebuked the religious people of his day and the elites of his day. He criticized them for the failure to recognize his coming. And he told them this: you know how to look at the sky and predict the weather, but you don't know how to recognize the signs of the times. That's Matthew chapter 6, verse 13. Just like you and me, the religious leaders could see dark clouds on the horizon and know a rainstorm was on its way. In the same manner, Jesus said they should have seen the signs and prepared for his arrival. The Pharisees and Sadducees knew the Old Testament prophecies, the Messianic prophecies, yet they failed to recognize the Messiah when he came. But their failure is relevant to our day and the times we live in also. Why? Because Jesus wasn't simply addressing the Pharisees and the Sadducees. When he said this, he was addressing a second audience, and he had a second audience in mind, which is you and me. That's right. Jesus was also talking to our generation. The Bible's filled with the prophecies about the second coming of Christ, and Jesus commanded us to watch for it and to watch for him. Mark chapter 13, verse 35 to 37. Our generation is also expected to recognize the signs of the times. But I want to ask you, are we? The world is complacent. Unfortunately, much of the world, including a large number of Christians, are not watching for Jesus. They're asleep when it comes to the second coming, even though Jesus warned against it. Because right now, a flood of signs surround us. Never before have so many signs, and I've told you this before, of the second coming have been present. Let me just give you a couple and not spend a whole lot of time on them, just from 2020. COVID-19. Far from being in the rearview mirror, the coronavirus pandemic is still an ongoing global emergency, a form of pestilence. It's one of the signs Jesus told his followers to look for. Luke chapter 21, verse 11. Global riots. We all know about Minneapolis and what's happening around our nation. In Atlanta, in London, authorities boarded up a statue of Winston Churchill to protect it from those threatening to tear it down. Throughout the world, we see images of arson, looting, and mayhem as a spirit of lawlessness prevails. The Bible says this is what people will be like in the last days. That's 2 Timothy chapter 3, verses 1 through 5. A global depression. Despite all the talk of a V-shaped recovery for the economy, no such thing is happening, and I don't see it coming in the future. Last week, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development estimated global GDP could plummet as much as 8% this year, twice what it previously announced in March. So they're upping even the numbers there. If these figures are correct, the current economic downturn will be twice as bad as the Great Recession and the worst economic contraction since the Great Depression. Last week also brought bad news on the employment front. More than 1.5 million people in the United States filed for new unemployment claims. To put this number in perspective for you, prior to March, the largest weekly unemployment claim number in the United States history was 695,000 in October of 1982. And last week it was 1.5 million. The Bible says a similar economic catastrophe will pave the way for Antichrist. That's Revelation 6, 5 and 6. Then there are the swarms of locusts, which I've been telling you about. This year saw the emergence of one of the largest and worst locust plagues on the planet. Billions of locusts, ranging anywhere from 1/3 of a mile to 100 square miles or more, have attacked crops on 2 continents. The hardest hit areas so far have included East Africa, Kenya, Somalia, Sudan, Southern Sudan, Uganda, and Ethiopia. And the Middle East, Yemen, Saudi Arabia, and Iran. And Southwest Asia, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India, and they're still going strong. These swarms will continue to thrive and spread well into late July, we're told. As these locusts swarm to destroy crops, millions face the prospect of famine in parts of the world where food insecurity is already common. Famine is one of the signs Jesus said to look for, Matthew 24:7. Then there's rumors of wars. On July 1st, the Israeli government will formally consider annexation of parts of the West Bank. If it does, Jordan has said it will end its 27-year-old peace treaty with the Jewish state. The Palestinian Authority has said it would end its relationship with Israel. And Hamas has warned any such annexation will ignite a new intifada. Only time will tell what July brings, but rumors of war are widespread. And Jesus said rumors of war will be another sign of his coming. Matthew 24, verse 6. But these are just the latest signs. Many of the signs Jesus and the prophets said to look for appeared long before 2020. Generations of Christians lived and died without witnessing a single sign of the second coming. Yet our generation has witnessed to all of them. Those signs include Israel back in the land, Israel control of Jerusalem, the gospel preached throughout the world. In the past 2 centuries, for example, Christians have brought the gospel to every single nation in the world. Today, missionaries live in every nation. The Bible is translated into hundreds of languages, and the message of Jesus is sent around the world by radio, TV, satellite, and the internet. Our generation is literally on the verge of spreading the gospel to every last person on earth. Increased travel and knowledge, that's Daniel chapter 12, verse 4. For centuries of human history, dramatic signs and travel and knowledge did not take place. Yet the last 200 years have seen the explosions in the speed and frequency of travel, as well as the amount of availability of knowledge. Arrival of exponential curve. Jesus said a variety of global signs will come before his return and the end of the age. These signs will be spiritual, natural, societal, and political in nature. And he said they will appear in a distinct way like birth pangs. That's in Matthew chapter 24, verse 38. This means the frequency and the intensity of these signs will increase as we near them and as we near his return. Our generation has seen the exponential increase in war and famine Jesus had to look for. In the 20th century alone, more people died from war and famine than lived on the earth when Jesus spoke those words. Israel surrounded by enemies. Psalm 83:4, Psalm 83:12, Ezekiel 11:14-17, Ezekiel 35:10. Ever since the rebirth of Israel in 1948, the daily headlines have included these Bible verses. Israeli Muslim neighbors claim the land of Israel is for themselves, and they have no regard for the God of Israel. Israel's exceedingly great army. Ezekiel said in the end times, Israel will field an exceedingly great army. That's Ezekiel 37:10. Zechariah said Israel will be like a fire among sheaves of grain, burning up their neighborhood nations. Zechariah 12:6. And even the weakest Israeli soldier will be like David. Zechariah 12:8. Since 1948, Israel has fought no less than 4 conventional wars against its neighbors and numerous skirmishes. Despite being outnumbered more than 50-1, Israel has achieved overwhelming victory every single time. Then there's the rise of Gog and Magog. The Bible says a military alliance that includes Russia, Iran, and Turkey, and a number of Muslim nations will attack Israel from the north. Ezekiel 38:15 and 39:2. And it says they'll do this in the latter days. Ezekiel 38:8. When God brings his people home from among the enemy nations. Ezekiel 39:27. Today, we see those very nations forming an alliance that has never ever existed in the world history. And all 3 have troops in Syria right now, a nation on Israel's northern border. The rise of the united Europe. The Bible says a revived Roman Empire will come to power in the end times. Daniel 2, Daniel 7, Revelation 17. According to Daniel, it will be a 10-nation alliance of weak and strong nations. Some parts will be strong as iron, while other parts will be as weak as clay. Daniel 2:42. We see the beginning of this alliance in the European Union, a coalition of weak and strong nations struggling to stay together. Then there's the rise of a global government. The Bible says a single government will rule the world politically, Revelation 13:7, religiously, Revelation 13:8, and economically, Revelation 13:16-17. In the last days, it will rule over all people, tribes, and languages on the face of the earth, Revelation 13:7. Its authority will be so complete, no one will be able to buy or sell anything without its permission, Revelation 13:16-17. So for centuries, a true global government was impossible. Think of what I'm telling you. None of these things have ever happened. None of these things were even possible. But you're living in the age of possibility that there are happening. Today, world leaders openly discuss a one world government. And cryptocurrencies and electronic banking foreshadow an economic system where people can be shut off from any kind of commerce. Then there's the denial of the signs, which is another sign in itself. Almost 2,000 years ago, Peter issued a warning. He said, in the last days, people will mock the idea of Jesus returning. They will make fun of those who believe in the second coming, and they'll say things like, I thought Jesus was coming back. What happened to his promises? Generation after generation has said he's coming. Yet since the beginning of the world, everything has remained the same. That's what he said to say in 2 Peter 3:3-4. This is exactly what we're hearing people say today. Given all these signs, you can be certain of one thing. Jesus is coming. And ours is the generation, I believe, that will witness his return. How can I be so sure? Pretty simple. All these signs are converging. Jesus said, when you see these signs come together, you can know that his return is near. In fact, he said the generation witnessing these signs will not pass away before he returns in Matthew 24:34. So keep in mind, for 1,878 years of Christianity, from AD 70 to AD 1948, none of these signs were present. Today, every single one of them are present. That means Jesus is at the door, Matthew 24:33. He also said about the days of Noah, when the disciples asked Jesus to describe the signs of his coming and the end of the age, he pointed to many signs. But one of the most overlooked one is the idea that when he returns, the world will be like it was in the days of Noah. Jesus said, in those days before the flood, the people were enjoying banquets and parties and weddings right up to the time Noah entered into his boat. People didn't realize what was going to happen until the flood came and swept them all away. That is the way it will be when the Son of Man comes. Look around you. Despite all the chaos and turmoil, people are living their lives as if everything's normal. Even though they've been sequestered, they're starting to break out now and wanting to do as much as they possibly can. All over the globe, we can see something going on. As in the days of Noah, they don't realize what's coming. Noah's generation didn't think the flood would come, but it came. Generation after generation has said about Jesus coming, but you and I may be living in what I call the Omega generation, the very last one. Don't ignore the signs. Let me give you a little bit more that's going on in the news tonight. As we look at the New World Order, which obviously is part of what I just told you, we'll talk about this. The Supreme Court reminds us why our trust should be in God alone and not in man. Trusting the government invites disappointment. Listen well. In short, when it comes to changing the society, we cannot put our trust in the courts. We can't put our trust in a president or in the media, obviously. Certainly, the actions and decisions of our government and its institutions can have massive implications for good or for bad. But real societal change, the kind of change we must have, cannot come by legislation or executive order or ruling. It can only come through the changed hearts of people, which then changes the will of the people, which then makes its way up to the courts and the White House and the government. Government cannot save us. Only Jesus can save. He has to be our message, especially now. For years, we put our trust in government. We hoped that the president would hold the line, that the right appointees of the Supreme Court would help stem the flood of unrighteousness, that a politically active church would turn our nation back. But we have been misled. We have put our confidence in flesh. In our fight for religious rights, we have subtly confessed, in man do we trust. But government cannot save. Only Jesus can save. And again, he must be our message. We should exercise our rights and vote, absolutely. We should meet our children's educators and write to our elected officials. But the key was changing the hearts and the minds of people. Otherwise, the change we long for will never come. Is this too spiritual of an idea to put out there? Well, who was the critical swing vote in the Obergefell versus Hodges decision redefining marriage? It was none other than Anthony Kennedy. And who nominated Kennedy to the Supreme Court? None other than Ronald Reagan. So one of our greatest conservative presidents nominated the man who played the pivotal role in calling same-sex unions marriage. Let me give you a little more. We can't deny that Kennedy was selected by Reagan too. So much for our man in the White House changing SCOTUS. As for George H. Bush, Bush nominated David Souter. Politico tells us the rest. While Souter voted along generally conservative lines in the first year on the bench, he soon began to drift left. By 1992, he reaffirmed Roe versus Wade decision. On cases ranging from voluntary school prayer to affirmative action, Souter lined up with his liberal colleagues. By 1995, the conservative Weekly Standard labeled him a stealth justice and called him one of the staunchest liberals on the court, a more reliable champion of liberal causes than Clinton appointees Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. Listen, Bush also appointed Chief Justice John Roberts, the swing vote in Obamacare, and one of the two key votes in Monday's election. Trump appoints Gorsuch and disappointed us, but God never will. And again, it brings us to the present. The first of President two's appointees, Neil Gorsuch, has stabbed conservatives in the back with his ludicrous redefining of the word sex. And as if his vote was not bad enough, he wrote the opinion for the majority. So what in the world's happening? Well, while we continue to vote and lobby, we remember this simple truth. Again, we must put our trust in God and the gospel, not in government. But that's where the reality check comes in. The Supreme Court will disappoint us again, and we can only expect the President or Congress to do so much. As for those who voted for Trump primarily with the courts in mind, the Gorsuch ruling is both a slap in the face and a stark reminder of the point. We must be careful where we put our trust. So while we continue to vote and lobby, we must remember the simple truth. We must put our trust in God and the gospel, not the government. The Lord and his message will never fail us. Our government and its institutions sooner or later most certainly will. As we continue to talk about our society and what's happening there, let me give you this article that came out today. Why can't you get canceled for anti-Semitism? So we see a whole lot of canceling, a whole lot of woke alertness all over the place, canceling everybody and firing everybody. Well, listen to this one. In the weeks since the brutal and unjustified killing of George Floyd by a Minneapolis police officer, America has been undergoing what the New York Times approvingly called a reckoning that marks a fundamental shift in attitudes about race. Now, let me say the obvious. Race isn't just about whites or blacks. It's about Jews. It's about American Indians. It's about anyone. It's about Chinese. That's race. It's all inclusive. But the onset of this surge of public soul searching and consciousness, raising about race, brought with it a trend that is deeply troubling. The heightened sensitivity about racism has led not merely to an epidemic of insincere virtue signaling out racism. It's also brought about a flood of accusations against alleged offenders that have more to do with politics and out-of-control illiberal and intolerant social media mobs than making a country a better place. The widespread canceling of people who are deemed racist is becoming a serious problem in America. The question is this: if it's so easy to cancel someone for not going along with the prevailing orthodoxy, what about what constitutes racism? Why does engaging in anti-Semitism not bring about the same moral opprobrium from the media? Let me give you some examples. They abound of instances in which people's careers and lives have been ruined because of their refusal to bend the knee, literally or metaphorically, to Black Lives Matter and to their movement that is determined to condemn anyone who dissents from their ideology or even to question it. One involves Gordon Klein. He's a professor at UCLA's School of Management who was placed on leave and had his classes taken away from him after refusing to grant African American students exemptions from taking final exams because of their collective state of mind after the death of Floyd. The university took the action after angry students accused him of racism and because he had paraphrased Dr. Martin Luther King Jr.'s famous statement about judging people by the content of their character rather than the color of their skin. Dr. King said that. Klein, who had taught at the school for 39 years, was doxxed by the students. They made public his email and his home address. He's now under police protection because of death threats, and he isn't alone. Tiffany Riley, a Vermont school principal, was placed on administrative leave for a Facebook post that said while she agreed that Black Lives Matter, she didn't support coercive measures to advance that cause or the demonization of police. Harold Euling, who was fired from a consulting job at the Federal Reserve for saying that Black Lives Matter had torpedoed itself by aligning the movement which calls for defunding the police. A mob of outraged economists and journalists led by the New York Times, Paul Krugman, wanted Uling's head on a spike for the offense. Though Ulig had issued a groveling apology for his heresy, the Fed accredited to the demand, saying there was no room at the institution for racism, even though the Economist's statement could not credibly be described as such a thing. There are many other examples of similar incidents of people being canceled over dubious accusations of racism. But what is also interesting about what's going on is that far more egregious examples of anti-Semitic hate aren't producing the same results. One prominent example was that of a popular comedian and television star, Chelsea Handler, who approvingly posted a video of Nation of Islam hate monger Louis Farrakhan on her Instagram page this past weekend. Handler said a Farrakhan statement on racism from an old clip from the Phil Donahue show was powerful. Farrakhan is a purveyor of anti-Semitic conspiracy theories and against Jews. But according to Handler, his comments about the evils of racism directed at blacks deserve to stand alone, even though his comments were against the Jews. When a commentator asked her if she would single out for praise some of the out-of-context statements of Adolf Hitler, she argued that Farrakhan said it was different because, quote, he's just responsible for his own promotion of anti-Semitic beliefs. They're different. In other words, anti-Semitism is just another opinion an otherwise laudable person might hold, not evidence of murderous hate. In the current moral panic about racism, one might have expected a surge of anger directed to Handler by her colleagues in the entertainment industry, in addition to announcements that indicated that both individuals and companies wouldn't work with her in the future. That's what should have happened. That's because that's what's happening everywhere. But it didn't happen. Instead, several celebrities, even more famous, such as Jennifer Aniston, Jennifer Gardner, and Michelle Pfeiffer, voiced their support for her. Handler's ability to survive this incident with their career intact shows that the myths about Hollywood being controlled by Jews is nonsense. In early 2019, newly elected Representative Ilhan Omar, Democrat from Minnesota, made a splash by engaging in anti-Semitic incitement against Jews in Israel, with accusations about AIPAC buying congressional support for Israel with the Benjamins, $100 bills, coupled with charges that supporters of the Jewish state were guilty of dual loyalty. While many on both sides of the aisle condemned her remarks, when push came to shove, congressional Democrats refused to censor her. Omar was rewarded with a seat on the Foreign Affairs Committee, think of this, where she could pursue her vendetta against Israel and support for the anti-Semitic BDS movement. More than that, she got a pass from the same cultural forces that are canceling dissenters from the BLM mantra by being treated as an honored celebrity. None of that has changed. Since during the past 2 weeks, she has made the rounds of Sunday morning talk shows where hosts like CNN's Jake Tapper fawn all over her. The practice of shunning, and silencing those with unpopular or even offensive views is antithetical to democracy and the free exchange of ideas. And that is especially true when it involves actions or statements that are not actually racist. We already know that the consequences of giving anti-Semitic Semites a pass can lead to horror. Apparently, those who pose as such the supposedly enlightened guardians of our culture have either forgotten that or they no longer care about it. An interesting poll has come out this week. This says this: folks in the United States are more unhappy today than they've been in nearly 50 years. So what a year it's been. First, the greatest public health crisis in 100 years hits us. Then the U.S. economy implodes. And now streets of many of our major cities resemble war zones of rioting and looting and violence. It has been one thing after another, and this has taken a great toll on the mental health of American people. Of course, we weren't exactly in great shape to begin with. In 2019, it was being reported that the suicide rate in the United States was at an all-time high. Alcohol-related deaths were at an all-time record high, and drug overdose deaths were again at an all-time record high. So the truth is that we were already deeply miserable before 2020 came along. And now, a brand new survey has discovered that as a result of everything that has happened so far this year, we've become even more unhappy. Here's a spoiler alert. 2020 has been rough on the American psyche. Folks in the United States are more unhappy today than they've been in nearly 50 years. This bold yet unsurprising conclusion comes from the COVID response tracking study conducted by NORC, N-O-R-C-K, at the University of Chicago. It finds that just 14% of Americans say that they're very happy, down from 31% who said the same in 2018. So let me ask you a question. Would you say that you are very happy with your life? I hope so. I would think that most of the people listening to me tonight are more content with their lives than the general population as a whole. But according to the survey, the coronavirus lockdowns are one of the big reasons why Americans are feeling less happy. Being forced to stay away from others has caused many people to feel increasingly lonely. About twice as many Americans report being lonely today as opposed to 2018. So compared with 2018, Americans also are about twice as likely to say they sometimes or often have felt a lack of companionship and have felt left out. Humans are inherently social creatures, and we were created to love and to be loved. I think that our politicians greatly underestimated the damage that social isolation would cause for many people. In some cases, the consequences have been absolutely devastating. Meanwhile, a lot of Americans are also feeling unhappy these days due to economic reasons. Up to this point in 2020, more than 100,000 businesses have permanently shut down. Economic activity all over the planet has dropped precipitously, and more than 44 million Americans have filed claims for unemployment benefits. In fact, it's now projected that a whopping 42% of the job losses will be permanent. 50% of U.S. job losses come from the combination of lockdown and weak demand. 30% that have occurred as a result of pandemic will be permanent. In other words, millions upon millions of Americans have lost their jobs during the pandemic and will never get their old jobs back. Unfortunately, a large portion of the population was not prepared for the economic shock of this magnitude. Another new survey has found that 33% of all Americans do not feel prepared to deal with the financial impact of the pandemic. Even before COVID-19 was a household name, many Americans struggled to build up an emergency fund. I've given report after report where 50% of Americans live from paycheck to paycheck before COVID-19. Because things are not going to be turning around anytime soon, and they're not, the bad news is that much of the economic suffering that has been deferred by unprecedented government intervention is about to hit us in a major way. And the really bad news is that the economic problems that we are facing now are going to pale in comparison to what we'll be facing in future years. Needless to say, that is going to put even more stress on the mental health of Americans. So I know what you're thinking, why am I listening to all this terrible news? Well, hang on to the end of this. So if you think that people are going absolutely nuts right now, just wait to see how bad things will get when society really starts to melt down. But just because things will be falling apart around you does not mean that you have to be personally miserable, and doesn't mean that you have to fall apart. That is a personal choice. If you derive meaning and purpose from the life of your career, or your ambitions, or your bank account, or your social status, all these things you have accumulated, then you will definitely have an increasingly difficult time dealing with the things that are coming. However, if instead you choose to derive meaning and purpose in life from the things that really matter, you will not be shaken even if all of your plans, programs, and material possessions are taken from you. All of human history has been building up to this moment that we're living in right now. And you were born for such a time as this. So don't crawl into a hole and complain about how bad things are as the conditions deteriorate. Instead, choose to stand up and become the person that you were created to be. Today, after I read this, I went into a closet to get some paper for my office. And I paused. I thought about the Jews. I thought about affluent Jews prior to 1939. And I thought about them absolutely. I looked at my house and I thought, they lost every single thing they had. They lost their careers. They lost their homes. They lost they lost their money. They lost every valuable thing they had. Lands were taken from them. And they were huddled into cars and taken to concentration camps. And I thought, how many of us can say none of this matters? What really matters is your family, and your relationship with others, and your relationship with God. Not necessarily in that order. This is a secular article. Let me remind you that. It's a secular article. And even the secular people know that the things that matter are not the things we can stuff into a house, not the things we could put into a garage, not the things we could put into a bank account. The real things that matter are your family, God, your life, and your relationship with others. So we need to really concentrate on, yes, things are going to get bad. I'd like to tell you they're not going to, but they are. I understand prophecy. I've read prophecy. I've studied it for years. It's not going to get a whole lot better. And even if there's a respite, it's going to come right back. We know the end is coming, and we know that things will be chaotic when it comes. So today, make a point for you to understand that you still have life. God's still giving you breath, and you have a valuable life, and you can be able to reach out to others. And above everything else, don't think your happiness depends on what you have. Let me go a little bit further. As we go to Israel, it's Arabs are expressing hope to live under Israeli rule, get jailed and tortured by the PA. Interesting article. An Israeli correspondent reported that Palestinians he interviewed last week who stood and stated they preferred Israeli rule in Judea and Samaria, and that's the areas that are going to be annexed, were arrested by the Palestinian Authority police and taken to torture centers. Reporter was Zvi Yeskvi. He interviewed a number of Israeli Arabs for a program titled Arab Man on the Street. Some of the Arabs interviewed said they would prefer to live under Israel than under the Palestinian Authority, while others were critical of Palestinian leadership. Channel 13 Arab Affairs reported on the horrible developments. Everyone who was interviewed, every single one, including one person who didn't even say a word against the Palestinian Authority, they took them all and they put them in jail. Others who seemed to have not been arrested were those who had their faces blurred. The PA arrested every single one of them. It was about several people who all said they preferred an Israeli identity card because the PA is crushing them and stealing their money. The interviewer said, with fellow journalist Avi Shakarov, both of whom are fluent Arab speakers. Right now they're in PA torture centers, and this is simply horrific. These people are probably going to be killed for what? Only for the fact that they said that they don't agree with Palestine and they'd rather live under Israeli rule. The world doesn't know what's happening there, but the people that are living there do. Let's go a little bit to the economy, as we've been talking. Globalists reveal that the Great Economic Reset is coming in 2021. So where is this all heading? Listen to this article. For those not familiar with the phrase global economic reset, it is one that has been used ever increasingly by elitists in the central banking world for several years. So you could first hear it referenced by Christine Lagarde, the head of the IMF, International Monetary Fund, at the time in 2014. The reset is often mentioned in the same breath as ideas like the new multi-materialism or a multipolar world order or the new world order. All of these phrases mean exactly the same thing. The reset is promoted as a solution to the ongoing economic crisis which was triggered in 2008. The same financial crash is still with us today, but now, after a decade of central bank money printing and debt creation, the bubble is even bigger than it was before. As always, the central bank cure is far worse than the disease, and the renewed crash we face today is far more deadly than what would have happened in 2008. The truth is, the Fed is not a bumbling maintenance man. The Fed is a saboteur, a suicide bomber that is willing to destroy even itself as an institution in order to explode the U.S. economy and clear the path for a new globally centralized one world system, hence the Great Global Reset. It's not a response to the process of collapse we are trapped in today. No, the global reset, as implemented by central banks and the IMF, is the cause of the collapse. The collapse is just a tool, a flamethrower burning a great hole in the forest to make way for the foundations of the globalist ziggurat to be built. Economic disaster serves the interest of elites. Let me repeat it. Economic disaster serves the interest of elites. Now in 2020, we see the globalist plan coming to fruition, with the elites revealing what appears to be their intent to launch their reset in 2021. The World Economic Forum officially announced the Great Reset Initiative as part of their COVID action platform just last week. And a summit is scheduled in January of 2021 to discuss their plans more openly with the world and the mainstream media. This is the economic system, the one world economic system that Antichrist will rise to. They also posted a rather bizarre video on the reset, which consists of a series of images of the world falling apart and images of factories releasing harmless carbon emissions into the air, which I suppose is meant to scare us with notions of global warming. The destruction is then reset at the push of a button, with everything reversing back to a pristine, humanless world of nature and the words, "join us." The reset, according to discussions by the IMF, is basically the next stage in the formation of a one world economic system and potential global government. Are you listening to this? This is absolutely right out of your Bible, a secular article. It seems to fall in line with the solutions offered during the Event 201 pandemic simulation, a simulation of a coronavirus pandemic that was held by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the World Economic Forum only 2 months before the real thing happened in the beginning of 2020. Event 201 suggests that one of the top solutions to the pandemic would be the institution of a centralized global economic body that could handle the financial response to the coronavirus. It is not convenient that the events of the real coronavirus pandemic fall exactly in line with Event 201 simulation, as well as directly in line with the global reset plans by the IMF and the World Economic Forum. As they say, let no crisis go to waste, or as in the motto of the globalists, order out of chaos. With civil unrest about to become a way of life for many parts of the world, including the United States, the economy we know is being destroyed. The last vestiges of the system, hanging by a thin thread after the crash of 2008, are now being cut. The goal is rather obvious. Terrify the population with poverty, with internal conflict, and with a broken supply line until they lobby for help, then offer the solution of medical tyranny, immunity passports, martial law, global economic system based on a cashless digital society in which privacy is traded is erased, and slowly but surely from a faceless multilateral global government which answers to no one and does whatever it pleases. Christine Lagarde first began talking about the reset back in 2014. The same year, she also made a very strange speech to the national press in which she started rambling gleefully about numerology and the magic number 7. Many within the club laughed, as there was apparently an inside joke that the rest of us weren't privy to. Well, I would point out that the World Economic Forum meeting at the Global Reset in 2021 will be held exactly 7 years after Lagarde gave that speech. Just another interesting coincidence? I think not. The New World Order, the Global Reset, is a long-running scheme to centralize power, but in a way that is meant to be sustained for centuries to come. The elites know that it is not enough to achieve global governance by force alone. Such an attempt would only lead to resistance and eternal rebellion. No, what the elites want is for the public to ask, even to beg, for global governments. If the public is tricked into demanding it in a way to save them from the horrors of global chaos, then they're far less likely to rebel against it later. That's a problem, reaction, and a solution. So the pandemic is not going away anytime soon. Everyone should expect that state governments and the federal government will call for renewed lockdowns. With these new lockdowns, the U.S. economy in particular will be finished. With 46 million people losing their jobs during the last lockdown, many states only partially reopened, only 13% of small businesses receiving bailout loans to survive, The next 2 months are going to be a devastating wake-up call for America. The real solution for people to be form more self-reliant communities, free of the mainstream economy. The real solution should be decentralization and independence, not centralization and slavery. The globalists will seek to interfere with any effort to break from the program. That said, they can do very little if millions of people enact localization efforts at the same time. If people aren't reliant on the system, then they cannot be controlled by the system. The real test will come with the final collapse in the existing economy, when prices of necessities double or triple again, and joblessness skyrockets even further. How many people will clamor for a globalist solution, and how many will build their own systems? We see it in Scripture. Scripture says that they would say, who can make war with him? The Antichrist will answer all the problems, all the fears, should I say, of a world that's gone in panic. How many will be bowing in submission, and how many will be ready to fight back? It's a question that nobody really has the answer to, even after many years of doing prophecy conferences and many years of doing prophecy awareness seminars. Let me give you another one that's coming on. Talk about war. Jesus talked about the rumors of war. Rumors of wars. China, India, North Korea, and South Korea, Israel, and Turkey. As if we didn't have enough already going on in 2020, we're now facing the possibility that several regional wars may erupt. China and India have both been pouring troops into the disputed border region again. And now there's been an incident where they were actually killing each other. We know that Pakistan and India fight all the time. They are both nuclear capable countries. China is now getting into the fray, and it is also nuclear capable. On the Korean Peninsula, North Korea just blew up a joint liaison offer that it had used for talks with South Korean government. It was a symbol. We're blowing up the office that we met with so we can have peace. We're blowing the office up. It should tell us something. And in the Middle East, Turkey is warning of grave consequences if Israel goes ahead with the plans to annex portions of Judea and Samaria. If a major regional war erupts even in one of these places, one of these flashpoints, it'll be another devastating blow for a global economy that is already imploding. And there is a very strong probability that the U.S. and other major Western powers can be drawn into those conflicts. Let me tell you that all these nations are starting to get to the spot where their tensions are up. Any one of these conflicts is going to bring something major. And these are the wars and rumors of wars that Jesus talked about. In the Middle East, the Times of Israel is reporting that the IDF is gearing up for a state of war as Israel prepares to annex portions of Judea and Samaria. Just over 2 weeks before a possible Israeli annexation of some as yet unspecified portion of the West Bank, the Israeli Defense Force is preparing for a wide range of scenarios for potential regional fallout, up to and including a large-scale wave of terror attacks, while still not being told exactly what the government has in mind. This week, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu once again made it clear that he does not intend to alter his plans, and that means that the process of annexation could start as soon as the beginning of July. This could potentially spark a major war in the region, and Arab leaders continue to make it clear that there will be consequences if Israel goes through with this. It appears that Netanyahu is absolutely determined to move forward. It also appears that Israeli Arab neighbors are prepared to respond very forcefully. In just a few weeks, missiles could start flying back and forth, and the entire Middle East could erupt in flames. It's such a critical time. We need to pray for peace. But without a doubt, we're living during a time of wars and rumors of wars, and it certainly isn't going to take much to unleash a major conflict. As we continue on tonight, and I know you're bracing for the next articles, India and China talked about are preparing for war. This one says this: concerns are rising that the ongoing border dispute between India and China in the Himalayas will expand to include military action. At the end of May, many sources reported that troops on both sides have engaged in other physical attacks though both claims no shots have been fired, and that altercations have been limited to clubs and stones, injuring dozens. Each side has accused the other of crossing the border into its country, with one source claiming that at least 10,000 Chinese troops were camped inside Indian territory. But with the killing of a number of Indian soldiers, the conflict has turned deadly and escalated. Multiple accelerators, and China has moved an additional 5,000 troops into the area. The standoff appears to be the worst since the 2010 confrontation at a strategic junction of the Dolkon Plateau, where the boundaries of India, China, and Bhutan meet. Tensions between the two nuclear unarmed nations are now beginning to boil again. The latest confrontation may lead to war. It has certainly generated more rumors of wars, a situation that Christ told us and predicted would occur at the end of the age. Let me tell you, Jesus warned us that kingdom would go against kingdom. And let me tell you how brutal this was. They met in a mountain pass. They met for peace exchange. There were dignitaries that met. Soldiers were there and dignitaries. Not one one shot was fired, it was a precipice, it was a high hill, but they were pushing each other off that hill. They were hitting each other with clubs, and 12 people died. And that is at a peace conference. So you can imagine what's going on. This one is from also religion, as I can give you this one. So we've been talking about the combination of social, societal, and government, and economic, and religious oneness, all indicative of an Antichrist rule, and a Revelation tells us. This article comes out today. Global organizations converge to declare World Unity Week. Mrs. Audrey Quintagua is chair of the Parliament of the World Religions, an organization that dates back to 1893. Referring to the historic coming together of World Unity Week, Mrs. Quintagua said, quote, civil society is the sleeping giant that has been awakened to its power to create great global movements for the transformation of humanity. Reverend Victor Kazajan, executive director of the United Religious Initiative, said, quote, at a time when deep divisions and iniquities that fracture the human community are being exposed, World Unity Week provides a way for us to renew the fabric of our interconnectedness with people of all beliefs and cultures, and with our planet, while we continue to address the challenges we face. The part of this article that really got me is right here. The 2020 solstice will be like none other. They're going to do this during the solstice, beginning with an indigenous-led global opening ceremony that follows the sun, starting on Friday, June 19th at 10 p.m. and leads to a world unity ceremony that includes over 100 nations and the interfaith and interspiritual voices of Mother Earth on June 20th. So let me get this right. The world religions are starting to get together, or getting together. They're going to celebrate the summer solstice, the first day of summer, by following the sun and giving prayers to Mother Earth. Listen, we've come a long way since sun worship, 4,000 years ago. And now we're back to sun worship and earth worship. And it's a global movement. So again, ask yourself a question. Are things starting to pile up? Is things starting to dovetail into what God has told us in prophecy? By the way, I was telling you about the Supreme Court. I didn't tell you what they ruled on. The Supreme Court ruled on gay, lesbian, transgender workers protected from job discrimination. They ruled that today. And Justices Samuel Alito, Brett Kavanaugh, and Clarence Thomas dissented. All the others, 6-3, voted for it. So, as we continue to go on, let me give you a couple last ones, and I'm going to give you something that I've written. There's been a lot of talk about all these statues coming down, so I wrote something for you today, Pastor Correll's Corner, and I'll tell you that in a minute. This is Race is Not What Is Dividing Us, and this article is very good. My fellow Americans, we're being sold a bill of goods. Race is not what's dividing us. Rather, we're being divided by competing ideologies. So let's put the focus where it belongs. Listening to the news, which I don't suggest you do a lot, by the way, you would think that racism is deeply entrenched in every neighborhood in our country. That racial hatred is the norm. That judging people by the color of skin is what the average American does. But that's not true for 1 second. He says, I say, while fully acknowledging the very real racial issues we do continue to face, he has guests on his radio program, and here's what he found out. A caller to his radio show on Monday said he was born in Hong Kong. Then he lived in Ghana, West Africa, then in Ireland, and now in America. He said America was by far the least racist place that he lived. 1 week earlier, he interviewed Professor Craig Keener, a dear friend and one of the world's foremost New Testament scholars. He's white, but he was ordained into the ministry in a black church in America. And he's married to an African woman, and they have a son. Craig also has co-authored 2 books on race relations together with a black co-author. She would arrive for a job interview, this co-author said, for which she was well qualified, but when they met her, they would say, we don't hire blacks. He's acutely aware of racial issues and does not downplay them for a moment. He said that his wife, that's who he's talking about, a highly educated woman who speaks fluent French, suffered real discrimination while living in France. She would arrive for a job interview, for which she was well qualified, but when they met her, they would say, we don't hire blacks. She never experienced that here in America, she says. Not only so, but Craig told me that the worst racism she ever faced was within her home country in Africa, where the racism had nothing to do with skin color, since everyone was black. It had to do with where you came from or what strata of society you lived in. Racism knows no bounds. So how common is racism in America? Well, this article writer says, I think not very. That being said, he says, I don't believe racism is the norm for America. On June 11th, I polled my Twitter followers, 42,000 of them, by the way, following question, asking, would you be completely at home having a neighbor of a different color or a different race next to you? Now remember, even though my Twitter followers, a little over 42,000, are not so particularly large, are roughly equivalent to the national average when it comes to demographics, they're quite conservative. The strong majority are probably Trump supporters as well. So how did they respond to the poll? Just under 97% said absolutely. The exact number was 96.8%. 97% said they would absolutely be completely at home having a neighbor of a different color and a different race. Only 2% answered with depends on which race. Only 1.2% said absolutely not. And remember, this is an anonymous poll, so people can vote freely. As for the results, they didn't surprise me in the least, especially in Christian circles. Many of our churches are multiracial, especially if they're in multiracial locations. And when they are not joining together for multiracial gatherings, it's often considered a highlight. And in cities across America, pastors work together in multiracial coalitions. And just ask yourself about your own circle of friends and coworkers. How common is racism in your midst? And then there's the international poll. Asked respondents whether they would want a neighbor of a different race. 2013 article by Max Fisher in the Washington Post. It was titled, "A Fascinating Map of the World's Most and Least Racially Tolerant Countries." Fisher reported the results of the major study by two Swedish economists who felt the number one way to determine racial attitudes was this. The survey asked respondents in more than 80 different countries to identify kinds of people they would want as neighbors. I won't allow cultural racial radicals to paint a false picture of our nation. We are far from perfect, but we are hardly a country that is deeply divided by race, as the media tells us. So what were their findings? Well, Anglo and Latin countries most tolerant. People in the survey were most likely to embrace a racially different neighbor in the United Kingdom and in its Anglo former colonies, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and Latin America. Conversely, India and Jordan by far were the least tolerant. In only 2 of the 81 countries, more than 40% of respondents said they would not want a neighbor of a different race. This includes 43% of Indians and 52% of Jordanians. So America is one of the least racist countries on the planet. To repeat, it doesn't mean that we don't have problems to address. His point in the article is to stress that our biggest issues in America are not race-based. They are ideologically based. And right now, those pushing a radical leftist agenda are the most divisive among us by far. It is the radical left which has become dominant, championed by a complicit or foolish, naive media. They are the ones dividing us. I will not allow cultural radicals to paint a false picture of our nation. We are far from perfect, but we are hardly a country that is deeply divided by race. So let us join together and stand as one for what is right. I truly believe that this was what the great majority of Americans want to do. My last article is not an article at all. It's an opinion that I wrote. And I wrote it and I'm going to read it for you. It's about some of the things that we are experiencing right now. And you're not going to hear from a lot of people because nobody wants to talk about it, but I'm going to. I'm going to tell you about some cities where statues of Americans have been torn down or severely vandalized. Not just Americans, statues of our heroes. I'm going to give you a list of some cities first, and I'm going to tell you some of the highlights of them. Albany, New York, Alexandria, New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico, Alexandria, Virginia, Birmingham, Alabama, Boston, Massachusetts, Christopher Columbus was beheaded. Chicago, George Washington statue turned down. College Station in Texas, Dallas, Texas, Dearborn, Michigan, El Paso, Texas, Fredericksburg, Virginia, Huntsville, Texas, Indianapolis, Indiana, Jacksonville, Florida, Louisville, Kentucky, Madison Court, Alabama, Miami, Christopher Columbus again, Mobile, Alabama, Montgomery, Alabama, Mount Pleasant, South Carolina, listen to this one, a cemetery that Confederate soldiers were buried was dug up and vandalized. Nashville, Tennessee, North Fork, Virginia, Oxford, Mississippi, Philadelphia, PA, Pittsburgh, PA, Christopher Columbus statue again, Portsmouth, Virginia, Providence, Rhode Island, Christopher Columbus statue, Raleigh, North Carolina, 5 statues of Christopher Columbus torn down and thrown into a lake, Richmond, Virginia, Rocky Mountain, North Carolina, Sacramento, California, Christopher Columbus and Queen Isabella in Sacramento, California, St. Paul, Minnesota, Christopher Columbus, Sharpsburg, Maryland. I'm not going to give you all of them. Over 175 other cities where statues have been removed, destroyed, or torn down. Over 250 of them so far. Let me give you just a couple instances that really stuck out with me. From Ventura, California, and also another one in San Francisco, and another one in Los Angeles. 3 statues of Father Junipo Serra. He was a missionary that devoted his entire life to bringing the gospel to the West Coast. Matter of fact, he named San Francisco, he named Los Angeles, and he named Ventura, California. All of his statues have been taken down. 25 statues in all of Christopher Columbus over the United States, 10 of Thomas Jefferson, starting from Hempstead, Long Island to San Francisco, California. A Richmond Police Memorial in Richmond, Virginia, dedicated to the police in Richmond who lost their lives in the line of duty was torn down. A statue called the Pioneer in Eugene, Oregon, dedicated to every settler and early settlers of the area, torn down. A statue of Francis Scott Key in San Francisco and Ulysses S. Grant in San Francisco. And that just really kind of concerns me because he was a president and general who fought on the North to free the slaves during the Civil War. A statue of Hans Christian Heg. This one really gets me. Get this. Heg was a Union Army Civil War colonel and anti-slavery activist. His statue was decapitated and thrown into the Madison Lake by protesters. And many of these destructions are at the hands of Black Matter Live protesters. This isn't about race. It has nothing to do with race. This is an effort to destroy our culture, our history, our heritage, and our heroes. And it's no different than when ISIS marched into Mosul and Babylon and Nineveh and destroyed their ancient monuments, took them all down to set up a new caliphate. You see, or when King Tut III tore down the monuments of Queen Hatshepsut to exterminate the memory of her reign and set up a new dynasty. Or the Romans, who swept the world in the first 4 centuries AD and destroyed monuments and statues of public figures whose rulership didn't line up with theirs. They even had a name for the desecrations, damnatio memoriae, in Latin, in English, damnable memories. For the Greeks and Romans, being forgotten was a real issue. Eliminating memories of past heroes and rulers and emperors was a real way to put the current emperor or ruler's reign at the top of the heap. Are you getting this yet? The amazing thing is this. All through history, when statues were destroyed or names were chiseled off monuments, the attempt to erase their memory always drew attention to their memory and to their absence. Domitian, Pompey, Nero, Caligula, all of their statues were destroyed, yet we still know their names and the history of what they've done. You can take down a statue, but you can't erase history, good, bad, or ugly. My point is this. This isn't a racist movement. It's not to correct a wrong. It's a hijacking a slogan, Black Lives Matter, in order to start a new culture and erase the old one. Listen, final proof, this statue was removed from the American Museum of Natural History in New York City. Let me show it to you. That statue right there. It's of Theodore Roosevelt on horseback. And walking beside him are a Native American on one side and an African on the other side. And here's the irony. Roosevelt was an amazing man. He's full of integrity. Everyone that's written about him has talked about his quality of life and leadership. He wrote 22 books on a variety of subjects. He protected millions of acres of natural areas in the United States and Alaska that we call natural parks. He voraciously defended Native Americans and Black lives. Only president to invite a Black man to dine at the White House, first one to do it, his longtime friend Booker T. Washington. And the Democratic Party vilified and hounded him and his wife for the rest of their lives because he did this. And the kicker, the statue that was removed wasn't even about specific men. It was an allegory. Roosevelt had toured Africa many times. The statue depicting a Native American on one side and an African on the other represented Roosevelt's desire to unite 2 continents. The 2 men represented 2 different continents, Africa and North America. So here's my take to everyone buying into the BlackLivesMatter.com movement. They stole your identity of being black to hijack your country and eliminate our present culture. And by the way, thousands, millions of black and white people and brown and yellow people in America get along very well, thank you very much. Especially Christians who truly follow Christ, because God knows no color. And you can't be a Christian racist. It's an oxymoron, according to Jesus' teachings. So whoever is hearing me tonight, understand, the movement is an attempt to overthrow, not to correct our society. This movement involves brainwashing in the ultimate degree. This movement is not Christian. This movement is nothing new. It involves one thing and one thing only. Stepping away from your intellect and your intellectual thinking and buying into mob rule. No, yeah, it's also full of its own racism. I've never once been racist in my life. I've shut down people who were. I've never uttered a racist word, not one single one in my life. I grew up with racial slurs against my full-blooded Italian heritage. The names I can still remember, it was brutal. Racism from anyone is wrong, dead wrong. But this is something different. This movement has evil in its intentions and has an ulterior motive. I don't care about statues. I care about subversives and anarchists who are trying to hijack America. My last moment of talking to you about in the news is this. Think, do your research. Understand that one slogan does not necessarily mean that's what this whole group is about. Of course, every life matters. Of course, Black Lives Matter. But be careful what you join and what t-shirts you wear, because you may be promoting the demise of the American society. Thank you. That's in the news. We'll be back in a moment.